Chapter Ina. Digestion. Kleio Venier was having a conversation with herself. In her mind, someone was sitting there. The exchange took place in her imagination. 1,000 times, she reinvented it. In 1,000 versions. Each one came to the same conclusion. In the echo of unsaid things, the pain remained. In 1,000 things, she now discussed with the subconscious. Her father was gone, and in this real world, there was no alternative. Her reality was an irrefutable truth. No fantasy was able to change that. Above the skies of Germany, in a scheduled flight of Air France, she sought distance from this truth. In her mind, it was never far away. Her gaze fell out of the airplane window as if it distracted her from it. She flew out in the first place so that it remotely happened. The pilot made a model landing, the kind that was taken for granted among passengers. Kleio wondered what would have happened if she started clapping. How many would have come out as herd animals? But by the same token, people didn't bother to clap at the end of a bus ride, and statistically, dangers on the road were much higher. Like the ungrateful rest, she packed the hand luggage and squeezed herself with the current out of the machine. A man mumbled incomprehensible information through the loudspeakers. They were lost in the noise of the new arrivals, the rumble of their footsteps. Kleio found herself in the middle of the crowd, half carried along. She kept her balance after feeling dizzy for a moment. Chances were good that if she had fallen, the mob would have supported her. On the other hand, should she fall through the gap, they would trample her, as badly as people wanted to get through here, in a stampede. They stormed Section D of Terminal 1 of Berlin-Brandenburg Airport. 33,000 square meters of glass facades, 9,000 tons of steel, and over 160,000 cubic meters of concrete, in reduced forms. Restrained, functional, and noble. Qualities the Germans liked to see in themselves, even though the population lost more nerves with the construction than the ancient Egyptians did with pyramids. Dutiful everyday life set in. The smell of machinery mingled with scents of fast food and Starbucks, to the same composition as in most of Europe's major airports. Workers and travelers alike struggled through the local ecosystem, in a Darwinian perversion of survival of the fittest. Kleio was at risk of becoming a victim of natural selection. Unable to adapt to the sheer mass, its perspiration and noise. Her flight from Paris took barely 2 hours, which, with waiting times and the train ride, seemed like an eternity. On the way, she was never granted rest, which was also due to the headache. That explained the thick sunglasses on her face. She wore them as a brand till last night.
Your own fault,
she thought. After all, she had wanted it that way. To say goodbye to a few friends, and at an unmentioned request on her part, she had to look too deeply into the wineglass. Actually, she avoided stereotypes. Unfortunately, it was impossible to deny how much French people liked wine. By someone, with blood as red as Bordeaux and a head as heavy as Proust. The exposure to the noise at the airport made her regret being French. Inwardly, she cursed her wine culture, from the innermost of her stomach area and brain coils. Explosively, the hustle and bustle ensued in front of her. Routes were constantly crossing, while they were in each other's way, pursuing their own goals. At a closer look, you could see worlds collide. From a distance, they became drops in the river of our collective. In meanders, they overflowed the banks, poured out of corners, over every spot like a deluge. It was a miracle that they didn't constantly run over each other, as spellbound as many stared at their screens. How they merged with the technology of the modern era and moved around in standby mode. But it was much the same for her. Here, too, withdrawal symptoms made themselves known. She decided to wait a bit, since she knew what was in store for her on the net. Neither entertainment nor trivia, Not what was going on in the world outside her own, but the raw, unfiltered confrontation with her life. Appropriately, a child cried out next to her. The father tried to calm it down. They belonged to the kind of nuclear family that one encountered everywhere. Everyday life followed them on vacation.
Calm down, for heaven's sake, Janine. You'll get your cell phone back later, and then you can go back to fidgeting on your tic-tac again.
Tick-tock.
His daughter corrected defiantly.
You're making me miss everything.
Kleio's hangover was too intense for drama, but the timbre of little Janine was caustic enough that there was no escape in the immediate vicinity. To her, the girl seemed far too young to be so addicted to social media. She vaguely remembered a time when children clung to stuffed animals and other toys, and less to online trends, which immediately made her feel older than she was, old enough to see the irony of our age, where unstoppable progress was pushing us toward mass mental enfeeblement and half-baked beliefs. How we were increasingly connected, gaining deeper insight into the worlds of others as we drifted apart like galaxies of the universe. As we reached for the stars we created for ourselves, and lost our orbit. Kleio did not judge anyone for this, even though some people put too much emphasis on their online image and spent too much time on it. At least they knew something to do with it. And wasn't it better to see meaning in the meaningless than nowhere? Her existence up to this point was neither positive nor negative, more a forgettable note in the cosmic events, so that she felt stupid when she complained. Almost like when she bragged about it, apart from that one blow of fate, she had been given a pleasant lot, better than most in direct comparison. One tragedy was enough to throw her life off track. Everything lost its meaning, except for sorrow. A social media feed couldn't fill that void. At the baggage claim carousel, she waited with other travelers. She watched the people whose fates were so different from hers, wondering how they were coping. Her eyes drifted past the people and fell on an advertising sign.
Change your life today.
It said in capital letters on the poster. Kleio continued reading the inscription.
Book courses now at Next Personality Coaching.
Besides was a model type in a suit. Kleio read the subtext into the smug grin.
There is something very wrong with your life. You definitely need help. Only his certainly not. Pas plus merci.
But would she best change her life today? As a convinced morning grouch, she pleaded that it was too early for that, especially with a headache. At the first opportunity, she grabbed the rolling suitcase off the conveyor belt, willing to hurry to check into her B&B for an overdue nap. She saw it as the only way to lift her spirits.
Damn it.
She remembered. In the rush, she almost forgot that she had promised to call her mom as soon as she arrived. Now, external factors prompted her to turn on her cell phone anyway. She left her luggage on the bench and sat down. Mentally, she prepared herself for the call. She felt her restlessness growing as her fingertip read the entry, Maman, on the screen, and ultimately struggled to tap it, indecisively, with the sense of duty that was conditionally hers, but that parents imposed on one.
Salut maman, c'est moi, je suis arrivée. Et toi, comment ça va?
She blabbered right away when someone picked up.
Kleio, darling, you're in Germany now, aren't you? And you can show how beautiful your German is?
She was immediately thwarted, which unsettled Kleio at first before the switch flipped.
All right.
Sorry.
Came with a slight accent. She soon got rid of that, as soon as the language found its way into active use. Growing up trilingual and 6 years at a boarding school in the German-speaking mountains of Switzerland had to pay off. So much was demanded of her daughter.
But good of you to call me, dear. As you can imagine, I've been waiting for this. Nice that you didn't wait so long this time.
She understood how to make a reproach even out of gratitude. Kleio guessed what she was alluding to, was conditioned that way.
She
paused, pondering on the right continuation. As diplomatically as possible, which would not seamlessly escalate into the usual discussion.
thought you'd be pleased.
A teasing, after all. It seemed the last thing they could take away from their relationship.
It has little to do with joy, Kleio. But I'm used to you letting me down. And yet, I care about you, dear. And every now and then I want to know what's going on in your life. If you're even alive. Since your father left, you're not the same. You lack all impetus.
Kleio choked her off, her voice almost failing.
Not now, maman. Not again.
Anger gave her new strength.
That's why I left in the first place. Because you're just fixating on what I'm doing wrong. Don't start on the phone. Not the way I'm feeling right now.
I don't want to argue, Kleio. I'm just in over my head right now. Plus the uncertainty with you. I don't know what you're trying to accomplish, but I hope you find yourself on your journey. I also wish that you take care of yourself and write occasionally. And see that there is something left of the inheritance.
If she had been there, she would have noticed how her daughter began to play with the gold ring on her right hand. She did that often when she felt uneasy. She rubbed it and twisted it around her finger. It resembled in an abstract way a snake biting its tail, plain and golden, with a thickening at the head end. A small amethyst lay there like a crimson eye. Her grandmother had bequeathed it to her, a good year before her father followed. Together, they made many a joke about the one ring, and a certain precious. Her precious. While the most valuable thing was the memory. It went beyond the material. Now remained the memory of where the money came from, that she used to finance the journey of her so-called self-discovery. She stifled a sob that rose up her throat.
I don't have much else left of him. I don't plan on wasting it senselessly. If that makes you feel better.
It does, really,
her mother replied.
Everyone worries about you, Kleio. You could take the opportunity to let it be known on social media that you're okay. You've really let enough time pass.
In contrast, she sought distance, which was difficult to achieve in the age of constant interconnection. Now the false reality caught up with her and held up the mirror of the real one. The one she was fleeing from instead of the self-image she wanted to show to the outside world. Instagram and the likes never felt more authentic. No wonder people preferred to play charades. That's why she avoided social media for weeks. Too many snapshots stirred up the pain. Certainly, the sympathy there had become ubiquitous. The fake compassion, not, I feel for you. More like, look everyone, it is I who feel for you. The tragedy became a fawning online acquaintance, because of which she constantly received push messages. Emotionally, after the function was disabled on her devices. Moreover, she feared begrudging the others if their lives took their accustomed course while hers stood still.
I'll take care of it,
she said with little motivation, downright absent-mindedly, watching the people around her. She didn't even listen as her mother continued to speak, but watched straight on. As chance would have it, an elderly gentleman who was walking past her dropped his wallet before her eyes without him noticing. She ran straight to it, picked it up, and drew the owner's attention to it. He was overjoyed and about to express his gratitude. Then he realized that she was making a phone call. Sporadically, she smiled at him to communicate that fact non-verbally, and went back to the bench to continue the conversation with her mother. That had escaped her entirely since then.
Where were we?
Asked Kleio casually, searching in vain for the thread. She was puzzled that the gentleman had simply sat down cheekily next to her, and was now looking at her full of expectation.
I don't know where you've been, young lady,
was the grumble on the other end of the receiver.
I've been here the whole time talking to you.
Kleio failed to respond, becoming unsettled by the guy who just made himself comfortable next to her. She had not leased the bench, but did he have to eye her with that beatific grin?
That's all right. I'll call you back later once I get to the B&B. Later, maman.
She didn't even hear her mother's call, hung up and stared at the gentleman next to her, not because he seemed so fascinating, but more to imitate his facial expressions so that he might realize how strange he was acting.
Yes?
She wanted to know uncertainly, asking as innocently as she could.
Do I have something on my face?
No,
he confessed.
there's nothing in that pretty face but perplexity. Sorry if I'm being too pushy. I just wanted to thank you.
You're welcome.
She replied, self-effacingly.
What kind of world would we live in where it's something outstanding to return someone's property.
In a terribly real one.
Came back melancholy.
But the right deed under the right star is able to change worlds.
Which she gave off like a quote.
Who said that?
To her, it sounded like one to remember. Even who said it. Again she played with her ring. This time less out of discomfort than embarrassment.
Just now.
He replied in a raspy voice, exhaling a snort to it as if holding back a laugh. He held out his hand.
I'm Nick. Pleased to make your acquaintance.
She grasped it somewhat indecisively.
Kleio. Nice to meet you too.
She liked older people, just found it most interesting. How some seemed to take everything as an opportunity to have a chat with complete strangers. She wondered if it was because people used to find it easier to do so, and therefore did so unabashedly. Or whether it was because of loneliness. A last generation lacked the understanding of the tools of the 21st century that could be used to remedy the deficit without imposing.
Kleio. Like the car from Renault. A beautiful name.
My parents probably thought more of the muse of the Greeks, hence the old spelling. But somehow it amounts to the same thing.
Meanwhile, she had come to terms with the fact that they didn't put too much emphasis on pronunciation.
The muse of the Greeks, of course.
He realized for himself.
I see that in you too, rather than an automobile.
She didn't know whether to take that as a compliment before he expressed it clearly.
You're a beautiful flower, Kleio.
She wasn't sure how to respond, whether this chap was just really hitting on her. Although he hardly gave the impression that his interest was of that nature, he seemed to realize that his statement could be taken the wrong way.
A feast for the eyes, forsooth. But I am talking about inner beauty. In any case, an old fool like me should admire such beauty only in silence, and leave it otherwise undisturbed.
Now only did something guru-like stand out. Like someone who found his center in meditation and carried it to the outside. At the same time, he was somehow suspicious to her. She got a bad conscience because he actually did not violate any rules of conduct.
And yet,
he continued,
somehow you seem to be missing something. Have you lost something, Kleio? Something much more valuable than an old wallet, or even that ring you're twiddling with.
He lashed out and hit the bullseye.
A relative, maybe?
Inside, another push message went off for her. A message to the misery.
Don't. Please.
She declined any explanation and rakishly said goodbye.
I don't mean to be rude, but I should get going. Nice meeting you.
She rose and took her luggage.
I owe you an apology. I didn't mean to offend you.
He spoke regretfully.
All right. And no hard feelings.
She replied.
I'm just not up for conversations I've been avoiding for months.
Which he acknowledged.
You'll face them when you're ready. It was foolish of me to think that you would confide in a stranger.
I forgive you.
She answered him half-heartedly.
Know this, Kleio.
He spoke emphatically.
Some come early to the formula for their existence, and others spend quite a few of their lives researching it. In one you see each other twice. In there some infinite.
She nodded hesitantly, without understanding what he was getting at, if there was anything but cryptic nonsense, and went her way.
A bit of creep and guru in one?
She thought, irritated, trying to look on the bright side.
The right deed under the right star can change worlds.
She repeated quietly to herself. She would never have called herself overly spiritual. Part of her took it as a sign that her journey was under a good star. The wrong deed under an unfavorable star let worlds end. Everything was subject to the principle of order and chaos. A web of forces exerted its influence on us. Causalities, vibrations, frequencies, and energies. About 1,611.23893 kilometers east of Kleio's present location, a certain Vitaly Lenkov saw signs of his demise coming. A man with strikingly angular facial features. The tension brought them out more strongly than usual. He hurried through the streets of Moscow. The collar of his grey overcoat was pulled up over his chin so that he would be less easily recognized. The afternoon sun heated the harsh climate. Still, Vitaly shivered. Because of another cold. It came from the ghosts. Although the alleys of Kamovniki were filled with passers-by, he felt left alone. Only the ghosts at his heels were with him. The signs of his doom appeared dimly among the people. Earlier than arranged, he ran off to meet his partners. His four walls became unbearable after he got the feeling of not being alone there. He saw nothing except fleeting shadows in the far corner of his eye. They flitted past him, were gone as soon as he turned toward them, and he dismissed them as optical illusions. His instinct, on which he often relied, told him to leave his home. Instead of calling his driver and wait, he rushed out of the apartment and set off on foot. Delusion had followed him, at passers-by who met him on the way. They appeared again and again. Strange figures, women and men, if you could call them that, in black robes with hoods. No one except Vitali seemed to notice them. From experience, it was possible to judge whether he was being followed. The conspicuousness with which these figures did it bordered on an insult for a hardened gangster like him. In this way, they were not making a rookie mistake. They knew what they were doing. There was no escape. With the patience of hunters, they moved through the crowd. They disappeared from his field of vision, reappeared in an entirely different place. Their visages were hard to make out, and Vitali repented when he caught sight of one. He shuddered because it looked fake. Waxy and expressionless, but too real for a mask. Vitali's apartment was not far from the Leo Tolstoy Museum on the Golden Mile of Ostozhenka, between Arbat and the Moscow River, a district of the wealthy. Whether they arrived at their wealth in a highly questionable manner, like Vitali, was secondary. The pedestrian zone was lined with Prada, Bally and Gucci boutiques and, except for art galleries and chic restaurants, prominently few shops of Russian origin. Crowds of people strolled around the shops or sat over caviar and champagne. A stomping ground of the rich and beautiful, where the beautiful were there to enhance the rich, the richer and the less beautiful surgically stitched up to hide flaws. Vitali was not concerned with the Botox content of the local high society. He had contacted the chauffeur and breathed a sigh of relief when he drove up in the Bentley. On direct command, the driver accelerated, and they left the pulse of the city behind them, where someone was insisting on stopping his. On the way, his heartbeat barely came down. It seemed impossible. But when he looked out of the window, he made out the same shadows, expressionless faces in houses, at windows, on the roadside. He was blustering into his paranoia. They had gotten into his head. In the lane opposite, traffic was backing up into the city center, while their route remained virtually clear. Huddled together, Vitali completed the drive, succumbing to the delusion of pursuit, a condition that changed little until the outskirts of the city, where the coniferous forests began. His chauffeur was used to tricky situations, but the tension of his boss was certainly rubbing off. A repeated, anxious glance in the rearview mirror gave him away. Rarely did the journey to Rubliovka seem so long to Vitali. In the neighborhood of the super-rich, one was neighbor with Putin or Abramovich, should one have the means to do so. Soon the Bentley turned into a private road, a few curves through dense forest, before they arrived at the estate, the hideout of their syndicate, where Vitali was safe. The mansion was a fortress. A 7-meter-high wall, secured with barbed wire, surrounded the property. A total of 30 guards patrolled the area, armed with Uzis and Udav pistols, mainly ex-private military and one-time members of the FSB, who would have stopped anyone as frantic as Vitali, and was not named Vitali Lenkov. Argus eyes from over 20 cameras followed every turn of the wagon wheels, watching every spot within a radius of 500 meters. 3 people sat in the command center, supported by state-of-the-art AI, motion and heat sensors, and self-firing systems in case of human failure. They watched over the palace, a relic of late Tsardom. Following the example of antiquity and the Renaissance, elements of shapes and colors arranged themselves into an elaborate composition. In the classicist empire style, recognizable by its monumental design and lavish decorations, characterized by the marble columns that structured the building a formal ode to the human pursuit of wealth and power, which the Russian upper class traditionally associated with themselves. In perfect symmetry, the complex loomed into the distance, adorned with ornaments and frescoes, lifelike sphinxes, centaurs, heroes, nymphs, and mermaids, carved in white marble, stood by heated fountains. The whole thing was sweetened with 21st century amenities. 5 guards stood at the front gate. With dark coats, grim faces, and headsets in their ears, they resembled Slavic Secret Service clones of each other. They let the Bentley through without further ado because Vitaly Lenkov was sitting in it. And this situation could only take place because he was sitting there, and all alternative procedures were excluded in advance, to an area that was as well guarded as the Kremlin. Nevertheless, Vitaly could not shake the thought that death itself was breathing down his neck, for which none of their paranoid precautions was an obstacle. He entered the palace under chandeliers, across hand-embroidered carpets. The rigid expression of paintings and antiques seemed to follow him. Furthermore, something that Vitaly did not see, but which he subconsciously felt, was as much present as him: the house or the decadent furnishings. He simply couldn't see it. The rattle of the counting machine resounded through the walls as he arrived at his associates, in a princely hall and completely out of breath. At a long table, they indulged in business. 2 stacks of money on the table, divided roughly into a counted and uncounted half. A bottle of vodka that had been started and one that had already been emptied stood demonstratively in front of it, with shot glasses, which served for the intake. In addition, there was a polished silver tray with a heap of white powder, which, even if these crooks were involved in money laundering, was guaranteed not to be washing powder.
Comrade Vitaly,
Greeted a thick-set man with a shaved skull in Russian.
you're early.
Immediately, he released a rubber band around a bundle of bills and placed it in the counted pile on the table, while his comrade ran the next bundle through the machine.
We're not finished.
Other worries plagued the new arrival. He walked to the window, took aside the draperies, and squinted nervously outside.
We shouldn't have screwed the German. Not for that kind of money. Nobody cheats the German with impunity.
He turned to his partners.
I think his people followed me here.
Simultaneously, both men at the table began to laugh in an amused duet of testosterone, vodka, and cocaine.
Don't worry about it, comrade. This is our town. The German has no business here.
Spoke the fat Sergei pompously.
Let him try. We are untouchable. Now calm down, Comrade Vitaly, and take a line.
Which he offered in their native tongue.
Stop calling me comrade, Sergei.
Vitaly retorted, annoyed.
We are the definition of opportunistic capitalists.
Sergei shrugged his shoulders and tightened his face. It was his way of admitting that he hardly cared about such details, let alone he understood what it meant. He pointed in front of him to the table, where a line of fresh snow lay ready. Vitaly strode up, took one of the banknotes from the stack, and rolled it with the approximate circumference of his nostril, before letting the line disappear through the tube in his airway. He clapped his hands as if he had just performed a magic trick. Instantly, his mucous membranes were numbed, along with his worries.
Or don't you like money?
He asked Sergei sarcastically, elated by the jolt that ran through him, with which he wrinkled his nose.
Maybe you'd like to go out and share your share with the people, comrade.
Self-doubt and fear vanished as the effects of the cocaine kicked in. His brain craved more. He picked up the credit card from the table and piled on a second line.
No,
Spoke Sergei with a grin.
I only share with brothers.
Then let's leave it at that.
Replied Vitaly, which would be his last words for posterity. He bent down again, however, when out of nowhere, directly above him, an opening appeared, and something shot out of it. This something drove into Vitaly, who was already successfully suppressing why he had been frightened before. He didn't get another chance to rearrange his emotional world. His innermost self turned outward. It happened much too fast for him as well as for his partners at the table. They only saw how Vitaly disappeared in a gush of his own blood, as his body turned inside out, imploding at the same time, and he was suddenly completely gone, except for a cloud of bright red fog, which immediately evaporated like Comrade Vitali.
The
The third person at the table screeched the Russian equivalent of "what the fuck," only to end up like his partner. Behind, something stepped out of the void again. Some kind of tentacle grabbed him. In his horror, he could only utter a strangled scream. It fell silent as it disappeared into the opening. Suddenly, Sergei sat there alone, surrounded by dead silence. The emptiness they left behind was a testament to the horrors. Only his gasp was heard by Sergei. It escaped his plump throat. The rattling of the counting machine muffled in the background. He got up from his chair and walked backwards to the curtains on the wall. Burglar and bulletproof glass lay behind them. He froze from further escape plans when he heard the low chirping above him, similar to that of an insect, a grasshopper the size of an ox. Sergei looked up and did not know what he was facing. On the ceiling stood a figure like on the floor, a writhing web of limbs, tentacles, and wings. Sergei did not get enough time to even begin to comprehend the bizarre anatomy of this creature. The sight of it gave him a headache and nausea. From its elongated head grew a kind of tail, at whose end a sting sat. It brought Sergei's observations to a premature end.